Welcome to Helping Organizations Thrive. Today, I have the pleasure of Keziah Robinson. Welcome, Keziah.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. You're all the way from Boston, so you're 4 hours behind us here in the UK. So good to have you on the show. I'm just going to tell the audience a little bit about you. You're a business strategist, coach, and investor. And you've got over 15 years of working with CEOs and leaders across sort of multiple industries. You're also the founder of Keziah Partners, which is an independent firm with expertise in growth enterprises, pivots, turnarounds, and entrepreneurial corporate initiatives. So a wealth of experience, and that's why you're on the show, which is great. And I really value your time you're giving up today. Before we get into what we want to talk about today, I want to find a bit more about you and really understand a bit what you love about what you do.
Oh God, there's so many things. It's really such a great question. And unfortunately, I know when we ask a lot of people what they love about what they do, they'll say something like, "Well, I like the people I work with." And you go, or I like my paycheck. And I really love getting to know different businesses. So I come out of the investment world. I started my career in small cap investing. Probably, I always tell people, if I added it all up, I probably met with 1,000 companies. And I'm now 20 years into my career. I pulled over, I got to update my LinkedIn profile. And that's something where the joy of discovering and getting into it. And then that is sort of the technical part that's so fascinating for me. And then I combine that with the really wonderful kind of similar joy of discovering the leaders that I work with and kind of helping them unpack themselves, figure out what the raw DNA is, and then put it back together. It's kind of like the same Lego kit, but we're going to build something new with it, both as a business and as a leader. So that's so much fun, and it's just wonderful to see the transformations.
Brilliant. I love that analogy of the Lego kit. That's a wonderful thing to think about. What made you realize that you love that about what you're doing right now? I mean, have you always done that? Have you always loved that? Or have you always known it? Or was there a moment?
It was a series of moments. So I would love to tell you I had some transcendent conversation or something, a lightning bolt, or I've always known what I wanted to do. But I really was someone who ping-ponged around a lot, focused on what other people thought I was good at. So it was like, well, you're really smart, or you're really good at this, you're really good at that. And I would kind of act in a reflexive manner. And I eventually started to look at what were the things that made the most difference. I wanted to create value. I wanted to really help businesses transform, which is why I got out of public market investing, where you're always just 30,000 feet away. And I started getting to know leaders, and I was doing a lot of consulting work. And consulting work is great, but I have the answer. I come to you, I bring you the answer, and then you take my PowerPoint and you put it on the shelf most of the time. Maybe 5-6% comes through. Or I did some interim management. I turned around a small business. I went in, I ran the business. It worked when I was running it, and then I left, right? And the business was set up to work for me, not for the actual CEO. And the business then began to kind of drift back down again. So where I got into this was looking at when did it work best? Because I wanted the businesses to succeed. And it worked best when I was working with people where we could build the business around them, and we could really eventually build the business so that they could grow themselves out of it, but ultimately play to their strengths and help them develop their leadership that suited them so that the business would thrive with them as the leader.
Brilliant. And I like that approach where you're almost being people-centric, building businesses around people.
Yeah.
I don't think you mentioned service, solution, product at all there. It's all about the people. And
you got to have a product, but like robots don't rule the world yet. I have a colleague who's always talking about the robots are coming to rule the world. But people still make all the decisions when it comes down to it. And we tend to think of human beings sometimes as this, this idea we don't behave rationally, or that we're the problem, people problems, as opposed to looking at really as, we do behave rationally when you get into the crux of it. And also we are the solution, not the problem. So I guess that's people-centric.
Yeah, no, and just on that, I want to explore this whole aspect of how we create in organizations, whether small or big, this sort of high performance. And the thing I come with that, and we talked just before, there's almost a fallacy that you can have sustained high performance and that watch out thing called burnout. And I want us to just explore, well, firstly, how do we create a high performing sort of leadership team or an organization, and just what your thoughts on that and what your experience of interacting with organizations on that particular topic.
I think all businesses fundamentally start with how you create value and thinking about what is performance. Instead of thinking about performance in terms of dollars, we get very fixated on these kind of concrete metrics. And when I say concrete, they're the things that like come into your QuickBooks or come into your accounting system. They're easy for you to find. So they're not necessarily that there's lots of other metrics out there which have a lot of tangibility, even if they're qualitative, but we tend to anchor on the ones that's like, well, I can see how much revenue we're doing, right? So that's our profit. I can see what our profit is, and that's our performance metric. When you focus more on how you create value for the community, right, for the client or the customer, whomever you're selling to, and then internally, you start to get a much better sense of what performance is. So I think a lot of what happens with teams is that we are rewarding things that are not actually creating very much value. Prime example is hard work. We reward all the time, oh, they're a hard worker, or I see they're working hard. And we're our culture of hard work. This is our ethic. It's very much something that we're kind of addicted to. You could say it's Western, but you see it. I think it's a business culture, and that's something.
Although hard work is, in some way, you can't really measure it, really, can you? Because I think it's a perception, isn't it? In reality,
right.
People can create a perception that they're working hard, but actually, are they working? And it's interesting concept, right? Isn't it?
Oh, it gets stuff. You get all this dysfunctional stuff like FaceTime and your hours logged in, and but also this, there's a tendency to create, the busyness, right? There's a lot of, everyone I work with, I say, is doing too much and not getting enough done. And so when we value, when you value the effort, right? And it's a perception, but when you value the effort, you actually aren't valuing the ultimate value that's created. So we look at performance as, well, dollars, total dollars, and then we look at whether, and it's not like, are you making more dollars and per unit of effort? It's almost like, well, you need to work really hard, and like we tie them so closely together that we lose the goal, which is to create more value for every, whether it's an hour, however you want to measure it, but for every piece of energy that I put into the business. My team, every piece of energy they put in the business, we should be creating more and more value, and you can monetize the value. So I know it's a little esoteric.
No, and it's interesting because I think it's important to get clarity on what performance is and how we measure it. And I agree with you. Often, organization, it's down to basically their profit or their sales or combination and something in between that. You talk about value. How do we measure the value? What in terms of how do you sort of conceptualize that value?
So I would tend to work with smaller businesses where it's a little bit easier for people to capture qualitative. But I put people into, I say, look, it's an energy investment matrix. Like you're looking at your mental and emotional energy investment, and you're looking at whether you get a positive or negative return on it. So you can run that with a larger organization where you can have people do a survey. Essentially, they map their tasks, especially their tasks, their responsibilities. And they look at, is this something it takes a lot of mental and emotional energy or a low amount of mental and emotional energy out of me? And then do I get a positive or negative return from it? And when you run that, you often are really able to isolate what I call the energy drains. And that's a place where sometimes that's a structural issue with a business. This would be something like a place where they value FaceTime, right? So if you're in a larger company and there's a culture of valuing FaceTime, then you really need to go to that's like tackling some of the ethos of the company. With smaller businesses, a lot of times what I find is, and this is true in larger business too, that there's a lack of delegation. So people have taken on tasks and they continue to do them even though they're not a good use of their effort, right? If you're going to have some effort put out, it should be at things that then generate energy for you. So you're feeling, it's kind of like running a marathon. If you just run the marathon to finish the marathon, what was the point of that? If I know a guy who runs a marathon once a month, he runs a marathon because he likes running marathons, right? So I look at that as a big focus for delegation, is to first help people really separate what are the energy drains, and in a tactical way. Like, you'll have a list of, and it's like responding to customer service calls. Okay, well, that's something you can delegate, right? Why are you the CEO of this company doing all of the Facebook and comments, right? Why are you responding to all of the people on Instagram? I mean, you'd be surprised with small business. Somebody have a couple $1 million of revenue and they'll be still on Instagram responding to everybody who says that my package didn't arrive yet. So that's something to start with, is to really look at just isolating what are the tasks that you're doing that you should not be doing.
And does this we'll come on to the delegation piece in a minute, but does this sort of, considering the whole, what impact am I having in terms of what I do, and whether that's when I go into a meeting, I always do talk to leaders about, you can't measure your impact, but in some ways you can, because you can sense when you go into a meeting how people respond, how people act, and then after the meeting you can see what is generated out of that in terms of passion, maybe some activity, and that's the impact. But you don't have a KPI scorecard that measures that impact. And I think it's been, as leaders, being cognitive of our impacts we have, whether we're talking as we are on right now, or whether we're on a phone, or whether we're doing an email, is the impact. And I always get leaders to think about whatever you're going to do, what impact is it going to have? Is it going to get to your sort of final vision, purpose of your business? And if it does, then the dollars, the pounds will follow along with it. It doesn't really worry about that. So going on to the delegation, and I've got a view on delegation. I call it empowering. I don't know if is that the same thing to you? Is because
it depends on what you're delegating into whom, right?
Yes, because it's interesting. I remember my dad. This was must have been over 30 odd years ago. He had a book. He was doing this sort of management course, and it said, "Don't do, delegate." And it's a phrase I've sort of stuck with me. But I think sometimes delegation can be deemed as a negative, as in people just throwing people at things. Here, you do it. So it'd be interesting to understand your view on delegation and how we should do it in a way that's makes more impact and more beneficial for everybody in the organization.
Well, step one is that isolating what are the things that really are the drains, right? You're putting a lot of energy in and they are just sucking the life out of you. And then what are your minor annoyances? What we often do is we delegate the minor annoyance, but we don't delegate the drain, because we think the drain's really important because we're putting so much energy into it. So we take these things that are minor annoyances, and then we don't question whether we've given to someone who actually finds that to be not that big a deal, right? We'll go, oh, customer service. Well, there are people who work for a living in customer service. There's the heads of customer service. You can have a fantastic customer service organization, but if you treat customer service like it's this terrible thing, and then you just delegate it down to whomever happens to sit right below you, you've set the expectation that this is a bad, number one, this is something nobody wants to do. And then you willy-nilly assigned it to someone, regardless of whether or not this is going to suit them. So I do behavioral assessments with all of my clients. And that's one of the things, is to get a sense of, just because you don't like something doesn't mean that another person, wouldn't, right? I mean, and often in smaller businesses, that's outsourcing. People do their own books for a very long period of time. And I'm like, there's an entire industry, it's called bookkeeping and accounting, of people who like to do the numbers. Why would you do it yourself? So
they're very good at it as well.
Yes. What, your step one is always, you're trying to delegate things to someone who's better at it than you are. This is when it gets harder, is when we start talking about, especially for leaders, about delegating things that you think you do well. That's the next, but the first phase is always, let's just start to, and there's I know another coach who says, delete, delegate, do. So the first thing is let's look at these drains and let's just start saying, what is the value of this activity? And often there's no value. You think you should do it, but there isn't a value, or it's easily outsourceable. Then you look at Delegate, and with Delegate, again, is does the organization need to do it? Sometimes we have this, I walked both ways in the snow to school every day, kind of, well, I had to do this annoying task modeling, for example, in finance. I had to build all these really complicated financial models. So that's what we hired junior people to do. And it's like, well, actually, that's something that AI probably could do better. So it would make more sense for you to hire somebody and train them to use the AI system to build these models, and then train people to evaluate whether the models really reflect reality. That's a better use of everyone's time than delegating down, well, we need these models and we're going to pay these junior people and grind them into the dust. So a lot of it is really being that upfront assessment of, what is below your pay grade. And I say that with the greatest kindness, right? You should be constantly upgrading so that more things are below your pay grade. And then looking at, like, do we need to do it at all? Does the organization need to do it at all? Who is best suited to doing this? And then if no one is best suited to doing it, okay, then we need, like, am I taking the right attitude? Do I think of this as something that's a pain in the butt that's really not that big a deal? Sometimes we have psychological weight. Around, deleting. I mean, sometimes I can't delete my emails. I'm like, oh, I have so many emails. And it's because I have this, well, what if I didn't respond to someone? I'm worried about it's not actually about the email deletion. It's about my personal anxiety that I might miss something important. But if I have 1,000 emails in my box, I've already missed something important. So what's the big deal if I just delete it all? So, so when I work with people, I say baby steps to delegation. Let's work through this process of identifying, weighting them, what's actually important. Then if you're going to delegate, who should be doing it in your team based on what you know about them. And then ultimately, if you do have to do something because it makes sense for you right now, what is it that's making it an energy drain? So
and it's that, particularly business owners or people in sort of small teams, they feel this sense of they started something in terms of a process, and then they feel they've got to keep it going because that's what they've done. But actually, it's understanding what people's role is in terms of, because I would say you never delegate purpose or vision sort of to anybody else if you're the sort of owner or the leader, because that's your mandates and for you to sort of drive. You don't delegate, oh, can you go and write me a vision statement or a mission, whatever it may. That's your thing, obviously in collaboration with other people. And it's that clarity of what's my role, what's my understanding of that, and how do I then sort of part that on somebody else that's appropriate. It's not just chucking things I don't like doing. It's putting things out which are appropriate to other people. So when you do delegate stuff to other people, what's the best way of doing that in a way that's really effective? Makes people feel valued, but also make sure that task or that process is accomplished in a way that you would like it to be done as well.
So I do think that when you talk about empowering, which is to separate delegating tasks from delegating authority over decisions, and then ultimately delegating control. And so that's to the point of the vision. The vision, as you're growing, belongs to the business. So if you're the CEO and you really want to grow something and you want it to have lasting power, legacy, that vision ultimately gets transferred from you to the organization. And that way, then you can leave because you're no longer the required visionary, right? You're no longer the keeper of the vision and the purpose. You have effectively transferred it into the organization. That is not an overnight process, right? That's something that takes time. But when you think of it in that way, then the organization needs to distribute authority, right? It needs to distribute control with some protocol of how decisions are made, right? Based on the mission and the vision and the purpose. So if you start looking at, even when you're delegating tasks and you want to go in and break down these tasks as to who should be doing what, it's going, well, what is the inherent authority that would come eventually with this set of tasks? So if I'm going to delegate the books, right? I might outsource that, but at some point I have to think, am I bringing that back in? Because what we're talking about is allocation of financial resources. and somebody else needs to be involved. I'm not the only person who should be involved in the conversation about the allocation of financial resources. So I still may hire a bookkeeper, but I'm looking on my team for who's going to manage the relationship with the bookkeeper.
Okay.
So we start with delegating something where I can still have oversight.
Yeah.
And then you continue to move up. So you're trying to understand what you want to check in on every week. If you think of it this way, just thinking of your task list, like, what am I checking in on every week? What am I checking in on every month? And that if you're saying, well, eventually it doesn't make sense for me, I'm going to be part of the budget planning cycle as the business owner, but it does not make sense for me to be checking on the bank statements every day.
No.
I ought to be checking on, we should have a financial report once a month. That's where I'm heading. Okay, so let's start with, maybe we're going to have a little mini financial check-in once a week right now. Okay, what do I need to know? What I need to know is what's off plan. I need to know when we're and I need to pick, is it plus minus 5%? Is it plus minus 20%? When do you need to call me at home because we've got a problem? So you start to look at the business from what the organization needs. And if you're not the only owner and controller of it, you say, well, an organization needs to have, we can't meet all the time about everything. I can't keep track of every single thing. I worked with an organization that was a nonprofit, and the exec director had 12 direct reports. And the controller would come by every day and be like, we got that check, we got this, that government grant. And I mean, it was literally like, what are you doing? The executive director should have 4 or 5 direct reports. And the controller should once a month be giving you a report, unless something like a check doesn't clear, at which point, yes, you need to tell the executive director immediately, because the executive director is the person who's going to get on the phone and call, right? So that's the kind of thing with delegation, is you're thinking a little bit more systematically about the organizational growth, and the target for the organization will help you understand what tasks actually are a building block to a delegation of authority, which is empowering.
And that's really important, actually, because that, what you just described there, creates that approach. As you get bigger and bigger, you can just start expanding that. And as you say, those parameters may change as it grows, because I've got somebody now who's below me, who's ahead of something. So they can look at the plus or minus 5%. You're more interested in the plus or 10% or something, where it starts to create that natural organic growth and sort of, I guess, key processes that will trigger things, and having those regular moves and regular meetings that would facilitate that. And it all comes down to that conversation, isn't it? I think often people have sometimes have the perception of delegating. You chuck in somebody a task, tell them, and you just leave them to it. But actually, no. And you're not checking in on them. You're more about trying to have a conversation, but also supporting them in that, because obviously you want to make sure that they've got the resource they need to facilitate that task or process.
Absolutely. And to the point we were talking about earlier with busyness, and this can be often one of the bigger blocks, is that as you begin to delegate, you have fewer and fewer things you need to do. So people often go, but what am I going to do all day if I have this team and they only call me when there's a problem? And then we don't meet every day. We only meet once a week or once a month. And then other people are, and here's the big one, they're doing their job better than I could ever do it, right? That's the point, right? I'm trying to hire people with this is, trust me, if we want to get into the real crux of what holds businesses back, is often that idea that you're trying to grow a business by hiring people who do what you do better than you do it, and developing the organization.
An ego there, aren't we? That whole thing where you let something go and they actually do it better. They come up with some ideas you never even thought, thinking, whoa, what's going on here?
So transferring, though, and that's why I talk about your pay grade, is as you're elevating yourself in the organization, you're either two things. If you're trying to leave, like let's say you're trying to transition the business to a new generation, whether it's a family or just a new generation of management, you're trying to kind of grow yourself out of the role, then you do in fact want to fully remove yourself. But most of the time the organization is growing. Your goal is to continue to grow yourself into a higher and higher and higher state. I had a conversation with a prospective client. He was talking about, well, with Apple, because it's, if he was talking about quality control, and he was like, it's always charged. The thing's always this, it's always that. And I was like, how many times did Steve Jobs, show up at your house when you were a kid to make sure that it was all charged up? Like never, right? Like, so that the idea is, yes, the organization has a responsibility for quality control in terms of customer service, but you as the owner need to be growing yourself into these higher and higher roles. And so they get bored as to what am I supposed to be doing then? That's the fear. And it's like, but there'll be a whole new slew of things that will fill your day, things that require your attention when you're the CEO of a business that's 5 or 10 times the size of the one you have right now.
Totally. And it's that challenge of, it's the controlling aspects. And I know when people have started a business and it's their little baby that's now growing up, relinquishing control, which is how they see it. And I always say to sort of business owners and CEOs in that state where if you're empowering people, they always say, oh, the risk of that. And I always say, well, there's a risk you not doing it, because if you want to expand your capacity, you've got to empower people, obviously in the right way, in the right manner, and appropriately with controls. Otherwise, you will just inhibit growth, because it'll all be through you, and you'll be the bottleneck for everything.
Right.
And also, I've always said that when you empower somebody, when you say to somebody, I want you to go from A to B, and here's the resources, here's the time frame, do it how you wish. I've got an idea how I think it should be done, and they come up with a more productive, more innovative and effective way. Actually, it starts to create ideas as well. And also then people feel valued, because they feel that I've got some responsibility. There's a whole gamut of things that come out of it, doesn't it?
Right. But I have to, as the leader, really come to terms and to a certain extent mourn the loss of being so important to the functioning at that level. And that's where the vision when I work with someone, the personal vision and professional vision they have, it's like, what is it the next tier up? What is the goal? And this is where, again, that organizational, really having some real desire to create value beyond making money is important, because there has to be something that will pull you and prod you sort of from both sides towards the next level, which will then allow you to cede control, and not even to see it as ceding control, to see it as the right thing for the organization, right? To be distributing these responsibilities. It is to be that your goal as a leader is to get the best ideas out, not to have the best idea. But that is really a pretty intense process for most people. It's an intense process, I'm sure, for you and I, right? Like I run a fairly, I don't have a real scale model, because I am very important to my organization, right? I'm the person who delivers the magic. And if I want to grow this business beyond a certain level, I have to start the process of being like, oh, I'm going to have to find people who do what I do better and differently. And that's got to be okay. And I maybe, if you don't get there, there's a business model for that. You're maybe not my client, you're probably not your client, but there's a business model if you want to. It's built around you and you as a sole practitioner, or as the central focus. It's just one that doesn't scale beyond a certain size.
Exactly, and that's the important thing. If you want to scale, it's not so much giving stuff away is like a loss, because it might feel that way, but look forward to what you may gain, and it's tilting people's head a bit more. Actually, this is what you could gain by almost letting go of that stuff that you're holding on to, because you'll never keep going that way. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for this conversation. I think we could have carried on a bit longer there, but keeping it to a reasonable length for people listening. So thank you for your time, Keziah. How can people get hold of you? If they're interested in learning more about you?
Yeah, if you want to learn more about me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's a great place to find me. You can also connect with me on my website. It's www.keziah-partners.com. And I'm always just interested in hearing people's stories and just learning more about, like I said, about their businesses and about how they got to where they are. So really encourage people reach out. And especially if you're having some challenges delegating or with your team, getting people beneath you to delegate. Usually you're also having problems delegating, just FYI. But please reach out to me. I'm always happy to have a conversation about that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.